All right, so I'm in the middle of my reissue of my autobiography in a revised and expanded edition, larger format, a little bit taller, a little bit wider, and hardcover and with full color, high-res images all throughout. So this is volume 1. There will be a second volume, but I'm not quite there yet. But that will be in a few years' time. And then, so last time we read through Michael Aaron Kamen's foreword and then my first chapter. So this time we'll go through the second chapter, which I've just completed, and I'm in the middle of working on the third chapter. All right, so. Okay, chapter 2, threshold crossings. And you'll notice, or at least the attentive reader will notice, that each of the chapter titles is in a slightly larger font. I think the first one was 14 point, this one's 16 point, next one's 18 point, and so on. So the chapter titles grow as I grow across the years. Now here's me over here in 1981, at age 13, writing a short story on my brand new typewriter given to me as a Christmas present by my paternal grandmother. Now that's not when I first started writing. I first started writing by dictating to my Aunt Lil when I was 7 years old. And so that's how we did it up until this period here when I got this. My grandmother, my paternal grandmother, got this for me when I was 13. And I was off and running, one short story after the next. Okay. Me with my friend Ernie Barella to my right, and Sean to my left, and my brother Tom Ebert to my far left in 1979 when I'm 11 years old and living in a suburb in North Phoenix. So we had just moved to North Phoenix from a very small, dingy apartment, which we'll look at here in a moment, that my mom moved into right after the divorce with my father. This next chapter will cover the period of my life from the age of 7 to when I was 14. It's a huge period to cover, full of events and transformations, including puberty, which is a difficult threshold for anyone to cross. But first, I would like to insert a footnote here regarding my grandfather's suicide. Years later, after my mother died, my brother and I hired a medium to interview her. We didn't tell the medium that my maternal grandmother died 5 days after our mother. But when we got the medium on the phone, she had both of them there with her. The medium explained that there was a third individual present who wanted to remain in the background, but as we neared the end of the interview, I asked our mother if she'd had any contact with her father on the other side. At that point, the medium said that the third individual was indeed her father. And so I took the opportunity of asking him if he regretted his suicide. He said to my astonishment that he did not, and that it had been the right thing for him to do, though he couldn't speak for anyone else. The dead, I've learned, don't sugarcoat anything. They're as blunt as children. So, to resume the story, my mother and my brother and I, after living with her mother in front of Camelback Mountain for a few months, then moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment in central Phoenix. There were 2 local malls just up the street at that time, Tower Plaza and Thomas Mall, neither of them very large. These weren't exactly mall megalopolises. Now I was looking for a father replacement, so I hooked up with an older kid. He was about 12 years old, I think, and I was 7 or 8. His name was Mark, and he taught me how to shoplift and how to swear. He would coerce me to steal money from my mother's purse and then hand it over to him, which I always felt very guilty about. But we would wander all over the neighborhood well on into the night, sometimes sleeping in the laundry room across the street, where we would plug in a small black and white television and camp out for the night. This child, just like my father, was very cruel to me, sometimes having mood swings where he would take sadistic delight in destroying my toys. And once in a while he would hit me. It's strange how he became an echo of my real father. This was not a nice kid. But my mother, too, was not only looking for a replacement for my father, but also for her father as well. And after going through a series of men, she finally found the man, whom she met at a bar called the Monastery, comically enough, who later became my stepfather. My father had been difficult, but this man was way, way worse. My father had certain qualities about him that I liked, and after the divorce, my relationship with him improved. Maybe not having me around to look after all the time, whether he felt like it or not, caused him to appreciate my presence more. Less became more, in other words. He had stopped hitting me, although he still had weird mood swings. But as I got a little older, 8, 9, 10 years old, he began to appreciate me as a playmate. He liked board games, and he taught me how to play chess, checkers, and poker. We would set up targets at the end of the hallway of his trailer and shoot at them with BB gun rifles, And sometimes we would even have squirt gun fights chasing each other around the trailer. So he had a definite upside to him. Soon my brother and I actually began to look forward to going over to see him for a week or two. My stepfather, on the other hand, was a raging tyrant. He was an older man in his mid-40s and deaf in one ear, so he always talked loud to begin with. But he was always yelling at the top of his voice, always hurling invective at us for one thing or another, and threatening to beat the shit out of us if we did this or touched that. I really hated him in a deep, visceral way. This was the sort of man who would pull up to an intersection, roll down his window, and yell curses at the other car if he thought someone had obstructed him, and it didn't take much to make him feel that way. Just a pure asshole. As much of an asshole gets. In fact, I just happened to have an old Polaroid taken in 1975 handy. This photo was taken by my mother in the living room of the small, dingy, one-bedroom apartment we were living in at the time when she met the man who would eventually become my stepfather, namely Joe Valenta. That's me there on the left, and Joe on the right, with my brother Tom sitting in the middle. I think this was Christmas Day, and we had just finished unwrapping all our presents. It looks like we're having fun, playing with a toy. But look at the toy. It's two guys engaged in a fist fight, and the one on the left is bald, like my future self would be, while the guy on the right is one hairy motherfucker, just like Joe. Coincidence, you say? Dear reader, I beg to differ. Look at the book on the coffee table near my right hand. It's entitled, But Wait, I happen to have a copy of the cover right here. Follow me. A book entitled Catastrophe, The End of the Cinema, published in 1975 by David Annan. Disaster cinema was all the rage in the mid-70s with films like The Towering Inferno, The Poseidon Adventure, Earthquake, The Hindenburg, the Airport movies, and so on and so forth. But wait, isn't John David Ebert the author of a 2012 book on... Yes, I'm certain of it. Right this way. The Age of Catastrophe, Disaster and Humanity in Modern Times. Coincidence, you say? Are you sure? Because I'm not. Anyways, to get to the important stuff. Star Wars, the invasion of the suburbs. 1977, ground zero for the event. In a way, my stepfather was a substitute for my mother's dead father. He was an engineer, completely fascinated with aviation and airplanes, just as my father had been with battleships. A skyman, in other words, like my maternal grandfather. Whereas my father, with his obsession with tanks and battleships, had been an earthman. My stepfather wasn't, however, a genius inventor like my grandfather, but just a worker bee, a drone who liked to help design aircraft engines for companies like Boeing and Air Research. So he too, again like my grandfather, was participating in the explosion of the space age across the American Southwest. Also, again like my grandfather, he was a functional alcoholic who drank his way through a 12-pack of beer every night. That spelling of pack is deliberate. And then got up every morning without fail to go do his worker bee job. I never remember him missing a single day of work, ever. Whereas my mother had been taking care of my father, she now wanted a man to take care of her. And my stepfather was a caretaker who was twice her age. But like Jack Torrance in The Shining, he wasn't a nice caretaker. He beat her up, repeatedly, and sent her into the hospital multiple times for various and sundry reasons. I remember having to have her spleen removed because he had beat her so badly. And those beatings only grew worse over the course of their miserable 10-year marriage. But at first, he got us out of the tiny one-bedroom apartment and moved us into a house in West Phoenix, a very bad neighborhood. During the 2 years that we lived in this house, I remember it being broken into several times. We would come home from the store and find things missing and windows broken. This was in 1977 when I was 9 years old, because I remember Star Wars coming out and exploding with signifiers like a new religion across the suburbs. My room was full of Star Wars things. Star Wars bed sheets, Star Wars action figures, Star Wars comic books. Indeed, I fetishized that film, even though I didn't see it for an entire year because I couldn't get anyone to take me to see it. But once I finally convinced my paternal grandmother to take me, it only played at one theater in Central Phoenix, the Cine Capri, which somehow had a monopoly on it. I already knew all the scenes by heart from having read the series, which was put out by Marvel Comics. And this is the Empire Strikes Back comic that they did here as a kind of mass market paperback version. And so when that came out, and that film came out, I think, in 1980, if I remember right, I knew every scene by heart from having read the comic book first. Indeed, at just about that time, I had begun teaching myself how to read on my own by collecting comic books. The first comic book I ever actually sat down and read through was Fantastic Four, number 176. And there it is. The Impossible Man. That was the first one I bought. At first, I would just look at the pictures in sequence, but then eventually got seduced into reading the captions. And before I knew it, I was an avid reader. As McLuhan said, the medium is the message. It doesn't matter that the kid is reading trashy comic books. What matters is that he's reading. That's all that matters. And so I collected and read every single issue of Fantastic Four from that point on. Fantastic Four was teaching me about esoteric cosmology, even though I didn't know it at the time. The four, with their superpowers, are human personifications of the four elements, and also correspond to the four components of Rudolf Steiner's subtle body. And the stories were always vividly cosmological. One of my favorites was the tale of the Silver Surfer, a metallic man who rides the universe on a metal surfboard as an emissary for his master, a gigantic being known as Galactus, who wears a suit of purple armor and lives by finding planets with life on them so that he could feed on them and drain them of etheric energy to keep himself alive. Here's one of their splash pages. The Startling Saga of the Silver Surfer. The movies that they've done of the Fantastic Four, it's too bad because they're awful. There's a new one coming out, though, this summer. Who knows whether it'll be any better or not. And it's kind of a shame, too, that there's not a good one because it was Stan Lee's invention of the Fantastic Four, I think it was 1961 or 2, that rescued Marvel Comics because they were just about to fold. They were running out of money. But his invention of the four turned everything around. They correspond in terms of Steiner's subtle bodies. The Thing represents the physical body, and the Human Torch represents the astral body, which is, as Steiner says, the seat of our passions and desires, our flames, you might say. Sue Storm corresponds to the etheric body, and that's the morphogenetic field of our body that's invisible to the physical eye, but that shapes and organizes it. And Richard Reed corresponds to the intellect, the ego. The Silver Surfer stumbles upon the planet Earth, full of living forms for his master to consume, but he meets and falls in love with a human woman, and his love for her changes his mind. He turns against Galactus and helps the Fantastic Four fight him in order to prevent him from devouring all life on the planet. Those were great stories. And so I faithfully made the pilgrimage to the local Circle K several miles up the road every month to buy the next issue. I was often the emissary of my mother, who was a smoker as well as a drinker, and always short on money. Though my stepfather always had money, he was a miser and never gave her much. So she would write out a little note for me to give to the clerk asking him to spot her a pack of cigarettes and that she would pay him back later in the month, or else I would come in with a pile of change and dump it out on the counter, and he would count it. And I was usually short, but he always gave me the cigarettes anyway. This was back in the 70s. I think people were nicer about stuff like that back then. And indeed, I had begun reading novels, and so now graduated from comic books to actual prose fiction. It was Stephen King who lured me away from comics with his 1978 short story collection, Night Shift. I read the stories in that collection thinking about adapting them into our own Super 8 canon. My friends and I were making Super 8 movies at this time. I was about 11 years old. I read the stories in that, but pretty soon I couldn't stop reading his books, and I read them all. This was during Stephen King's best period as a writer, the days of his alcoholism, when he was going through a case of beer plus cocaine, and also NyQuil, every day. Over the next 7 years or so, I read Carrie Salem's Lot, The Shining, The Stand, Firestarter, The Dead Zone, Cujo, Different Seasons, Christine, and so on, religiously, rushing to the bookstore each time a new one came out. I recall reading Pet Sematary late at night with my bedroom lights out, using a flashlight to read it under the covers when I was supposed to be asleep. That one was by far King's scariest book, and it really upset me. When I would go to visit my Aunt Lil, I began to start typing out my own short fiction horror stories in imitation of Stephen King. And no matter how violent those stories were, my aunt loved them and would encourage me to continue writing them. Her encouragement was probably what made me want to become a writer. In addition, there was a teacher in the 7th and 8th grades named Mrs. Heaston, a relative, she claimed, of the actor Charlton Heston. She was an older woman who had a fiery, irascible temperament, and if you ever crossed her, you were in big trouble. But when she read my horror and science fiction stories, she liked them so much that she read them to all the classes that rotated through. And she read every single one of them to the kids for those 2 years. So it was her encouragement, as well as my aunt's, that gave me the belief that someday I was going to be as great a writer as Stephen King. I wrote my first novel, Goodbye Blue Sky, when I was 15. It was about a post-apocalyptic society in which a new messiah had proclaimed himself and was going to introduce a new religion into the world, but he ends up getting crucified, just like Jesus. As a result of Mrs. Heaston reading all my stories to her classes, everyone knew who I was, and it was the first time in my life that I ever felt like anyone actually appreciated me. It was very gratifying one day when, after reading a poem that I had written, the entire classroom erupted with spontaneous applause. I'll never forget how good that made me feel. I was a hit. I knew from that point on that I was going to be a writer. And here's me reading The Howling by Gary Brandner at the Muggian Rim in 1982 on a camping trip. And that was, I think it was a 1981 movie that was made by Joe Dante. Also, at about this time, let's see, I'm going to go down to here where by the time I was 11, I had figured out how to go and see R-rated movies by myself. I would simply buy a ticket for a PG movie and then sneak into the R-rated film. That was how I was able to get in to see Apocalypse Now, which was another big event in my life. I went back and saw it over and over again. I didn't know anything about the Vietnam War or any of Coppola's literary references. All I knew was that the film transported me to a unique, dreamlike world that was as otherworldly in its way as the universe of the Star Wars films. And indeed, George Lucas had originally been slated to direct Apocalypse Now, but passed on it in favor of doing Star Wars instead. At about the age of 13, I discovered rock and roll, which hit me like a thunderbolt. I would lie on the floor in the living room with headphones on, watching the iridescent fish swim in the fish tank that painted luminous gold pools of light onto the darkened walls at night as I played AC/DC, Rush, and Pink Floyd. I went to my first rock concert by the time I was 16. It was AC/DC touring for their 1983 album Flick of the Switch. It was absolutely electrifying, and I knew I had found yet another new religion. Over the next several years, going to rock concerts was like being initiated into the Elysian mysteries of the suburbs. I saw everyone. Van Halen with David Lee Roth in 1984, Sting, R.E.M., INXS, Roger Waters, Ozzy Osbourne, etc., etc. At this point, I was about 14 or 15 years old, and these were extremely difficult years for me. The fights at home between my mother and stepfather were getting worse and worse, and one night I witnessed him break both of her wrists. She had tried to attack him, and he grabbed both of her wrists and shoved her backwards. She fell down on her back with 2 broken wrists. I remember her having to wear metal braces on her arms for weeks as they healed, and she was always in her bedroom, sobbing. The cops were becoming regular visitors to the house. They were there so often I began to feel embarrassed because ours was the only house on the street that routinely featured a cop car parked in front of it. She would call them on him, and they would show up, skeptical back in those days. If she had called them nowadays, he would have been taken away without further ado, but back then they wanted to know the full story, go over all the details, and then pretty soon she would become intimidated and back down, and they would leave, having done their jobs, of course. Also, the year just out of 8th grade and getting ready for my freshman year of high school, I lost all my childhood friends that I'd grown up with, making Super 8 movies. One day after school, they came over to the house while my mother and stepfather were at work, and they vandalized the place. When my parents found out about it, they were naturally furious, and they called the parents of the boys' families, and that was that as far as friends were concerned. I didn't speak to them again for about a year, and so when I entered the intimidating environment of high school during the fall of 1982, I had no friends at all, no girlfriends yet either, for that entire first year. It was a very lonely time. But it was in that year that I took drugs for the first time. A classmate of mine in drama class had given me some speed, and I took it and went to class revved up on energy. Normally, I would sit very quietly and not speak much. I was a painfully shy, depressed, and introverted kid. But that day it was a different story. I was chattering and rambling and laughing, and my classmates were astonished at my behavior. Taking drugs was a major threshold crossing for me. It made me feel like I was being initiated into the mysteries of adulthood. This is what adults do, don't they? They take drugs, right? And then I began at the age of 15 to drink beer on a regular basis with my new friend from drama class, as that spring semester wound down into summer. We smoked pot and chilled, and then, during that summer, as we'll see, he got me my first real sexual experience ever by arranging for me to have a blind date with his girlfriend's friend. And here I've put this novel, The Dark Tower, Stephen King's first Dark Tower novel, and the best by far. One of the best things he ever wrote as well, which was published in 1982. And I asked my maternal grandmother to get it for me for a Christmas present, which she did do. And she inscribed my name in the opening flyleaf there for John David Ebert, Christmas present, 1982, or whatever she put. And eventually I sold it for about $100 a few years later, even though I knew very well that it was going to be a rare book worth money. Nowadays it goes for about $2,500 on eBay. I wish I had hung on to it, but there is a copy of it floating around out there somewhere with John David Ebert's name written in it by his maternal grandmother. Someday somebody's going to find it. It'll turn up and come forward. That'll be interesting. All right, we'll leave it there. I'm in the middle of the next one here, Chapter 3, Sex and Violence. Moving into my stoner, that's my stoner hairdo there. About 15 or 16 there. It looks like about 16. So we'll start with that next time and have more fun.